My name is Christian Raffensperger. I am a professor and chair of the history department at Wittenberg University, and we're going to talk about this little book, Kingdom of Rus, today. So Kingdom of Rus is part of a series called Past Imperfect, which is published by Humanities Press and Amsterdam University Press. It is a series designed for small works, not much more than 30,000 words, to get them out to a larger audience. People who want to read, like yourself, Will, who want to read something scholarly, but might not have time for a massive 300, 400-page book. This is 100 pages in a small format and supposed to be inexpensive. They're retail at $15, so that you can learn something new about an area or a topic of medieval history that you didn't know anything about. And so that format drew me instantly, right? I want to write in an accessible fashion. I want to write for a larger audience. And so that was very interesting to me. It's not just a condensed version of the history of Kingdom Kiev and Rus. It is, so chapter 1 does that. It does a little bit of the overview of what was Kiev and Rus, what was going on in terms of its connections with the larger medieval European world. But the other chapters are advancing an argument. And that was another reason I wanted to do this, because I thought I could make an argument in short form that was accessible to a wider audience. And I thought, I do this in the classroom with 18 to 21-year-olds, I can write for a wider audience. And so the argument I wanted to make was that, in fact, knyaz, which is what we call the rulers in Rus, means king. It doesn't mean prince. And in fact, one of the reasons we use it as prince is simply because there's a modern bias against having multiple kings, because we conflate king and monarch, monarch meaning sole ruler. So if there's more than one king, it can't possibly be a king. Right? And so I'm suggesting that, in fact, no, that's not the case. In the medieval world, you can have more than one king. And I talk about examples from late antiquity in the Germanic tribes. I talk about examples in the German Empire, in Anglo-Saxon England, in Scandinavia, and Ireland, where there are, in fact, multiple kings all at the same time. And we're okay with that in other places, at least sometimes, but in Rus, not so much. I really think it's important to change the way we discuss Rusian history. Because if we're talking about Rus as an Eastern other, if we're talking about Rus as a principality or a series of principalities, when instead we've got the Kingdom of England or the German Empire, it's always going to be different. It's always going to be out there. I want Rus to be a kingdom that is integrated into medieval Europe, that you can talk about in the same breath with England, with Poland, with France, with Leon and Castile. I want all of those things to be talked about together. And part of that for me is making it accessible to a larger audience. And another part is trying to take away the difference. Right? If knyaz is king, and if this is a kingdom of Rus, that makes it much more normative in medieval Europe. It looks more like other places. And in fact, since I've written this book, I've gone on and talked about historiography a lot more in other places, and how we have chosen to privilege the example of England as normative in medieval Europe, with its kings and the rise of Parliament, the Magna Carta, of course. And it, in fact, is abnormal. It is not normative. And in fact, what we see in Rus, in Ireland, in Scandinavia, is much more common in medieval Europe than what we see in England. And so separating it from the book, that is the typical view of Rus and of Eastern Europe in general. For another project, I did a review of medieval Europe textbooks and how they include Rus or don't include Rus, and it's terrible. I mean, they're totally centered on England and France, and even the good modern ones often only make a gesture towards including Eastern Europe. And yet, for many medievalists, the people who traditionally focus on Western Europe, they think that that's enough, right, to make that gesture. But for Kingdom of Rus, it actually is doing what I want it to be doing. It is making a much bigger impact than any book that I've written since Reimagining Europe. I'm hearing from more people. People want me to talk about this. I've done 2 other podcasts talking about Kingdom of Rus. This is a book that people are reading, and I think the format makes a big difference. And I think that if people will read this book, they will want to read more about medieval Eastern Europe, Rus in particular. In another conversation, you and I talked about the conservative nature of scholars. And scholars, even if they think of themselves as postmodern and liberal, are often conservative simply in the sense that they continue to cite pre-existing scholarship as a way to talk about what it is they're doing. And so for Kingdom of Rus, for instance, one of the reasons that Kniaz was translated as prince for so very long was because when English traders first began arriving at the court of Ivan the Terrible, they saw a hierarchy where there was a Tsar at the top, and below him were members of his family called Knyazya, right? And so they applied that to their own system, and they said, okay, there's a queen or an emperor, and then there are princes below that, or dukes, because sometimes Kniaz was also translated as duke. And so what you saw was a 16th century development of translation that was cited from the 16th to the 17th to the 18th to the 19th to the 20th, and people just saw Kniaz in the Russian English dictionary equals duke or prince. Right? It took a long time to really think about how maybe that meant that in the 16th century, but not in the 11th. Right? The same thing is true for scholarly trends more broadly. If you construct a scholarly world where what is normal is a centralized king, right, who has a variety of barons, and then over time those barons start to power share, and that is normal, everything else looks abnormal if it doesn't fit that picture. And so one of the ways that scholars are uninterested in medieval Eastern Europe, and I would suggest that it's changing slowly, and we're being helped actually by the Iberianists and the Scandinavianists, who themselves are also looking to try and get included in medieval Europe, that their models are also not the same as that English model of a centralized monarchical authority negotiating with a series of barons. And so the more we can demonstrate that, in fact, medieval Europe is multipolar and has many different models of rule, of succession, of engagement, then medieval Eastern Europe will succeed. I think this book is readable, and that's one thing I'd really like to come back to. And it's short, and if one is interested in learning more about Kievan Rus and trying to, for academics, integrate it into your own scholarship, this is a way to start. If you are an interested Ukrainian and you want to learn more about medieval Rus, this is a good place to start. It is approachable, it is small, and it is, as I mentioned earlier, it is affordable at $15, right? And I don't make any royalties off of this book because the way the series works, it's an agreement that it's so small, we're keeping the costs down, so authors forego their royalties. So this actually has sold more books than any of the other ones I've written, and I don't make a penny off of it. But I want people to read it, and so I'm really glad the price point is so low and that it is accessible.